Hi, I'm Marcus Weaver Hightower from the University of North Dakota. I wanted to talk to you today about how to write up a discourse analysis, how to actually translate it into a kind of article-length explanation of the study that you've done. The first and probably the most important thing to remember is that there's no one style for doing a discourse analysis. You can have critical discourse analysis, which would have some features that would be different from a more sort of linguistically oriented paper. And a sort of corpus-based discourse analysis might be very different from a discourse analysis that looks at just one piece of text. So there's no one way to go about doing this, but I do want to give you what I might think of as kind of a typical discourse analysis article, and particularly looking at article length things. Scholarly writing is in a lot of ways the same no matter what you're doing, particularly within the social sciences. So there's a lot of things that will overlap, but today I want to talk a little bit about the things that would be specific to discourse analysis. Things like the fact that your title should probably signal that you're doing a discourse analysis. Now, it's not always going to be the case that you're going to put the words discourse analysis in there, but perhaps discourse could be in there, or some of the concepts that we would talk about in discourse analysis, things like intertextuality, those kinds of things might actually be in the title, and that would signal to people that you're doing a discourse analysis. Also, your abstract for an article should signal that you're doing discourse analysis. And generally speaking, this would be a good idea to have explicitly in the abstract, where you talk about whatever the methodology is going to be. You would have somewhere in there that you're using a particular style of discourse analysis. You might also want to have in your introductory paragraph, the very first paragraph of the paper, there's a lot of things that are going to go on that would signal that it's a discourse analysis and be specific to discourse analysis, including describing what scholars in the field need to know. What's the problem? And generally speaking, that's going to index something about discourse or the implications of discourse right there, right up front. You'd also want to, in the very first paragraph, somehow give a suggestion about what the general corpus is that you're going to be using, what the genre it is that you're going to investigate, any kind of speech act that you're going to investigate, whatever the kind of focus in terms of texts are that you're going to look at in a discourse analysis should be right up front. Also, somewhere in the first paragraph, preferably, but at least within the first couple of paragraphs, you should kind of provide a thesis that's related to discourse. So a sentence that starts something along the lines of "this article will," and then explain how it's going to expand on discourse analysis, or various parts of language and its social implications. Next, after you've gotten that introductory paragraph, you want to give some background information on the kinds of problems, genres, mediums, linguistic features, etc., that are going to be in the article, and write these for a very general kind of audience. So, for instance, if you're doing research on Twitter, not everyone on the planet is using Twitter, so you'd need to kind of give a sense of what the heck this Twitter thing is, and what sort of aspects it has that you want to focus on. And if you're doing a piece that's on, a particular location, like if you're going to do American college classrooms, what would a journalist from another country need to know about American college classrooms to be able to make sense of what you're talking about? Or if you're doing comparative international work, what about the country that you're working in, or countries? Do people in that are listening to this article or reading this article need to know about your location so they can make sense of your argument? Also, background on the actual sort of linguistic features that you might be using, discourse features, all those kinds of things. You need to talk about those too. So if you're going to talk about adjacency pairs, what the heck are adjacency pairs? You need to explain and give people a good background so that they can correctly interpret what you're talking about. Then, of course, you'd want to have a methods section. Oftentimes, of course, you can not have a specific section for methods. You can kind of spread those things throughout, but within the paper, you need to be very specific about how you've gone about doing the particular analysis. So you'd want to, talk about any previous discourse analysis theorists or methodologists. So, if you're using Jim G's specific type of discourse analysis, you'd want to talk about Jim G and some of his work and cite those kinds of things. If you're using any particular kind of linguistic aspects that, are going to be in your article, you want to talk about other people who have talked about those as well. Also, within methods, you want to specify the corpus that you're working with and how it was collected. Where did you get the pieces of language? How did you get them? What did you do with the pieces of language that you're working with? So specify that corpus. Also, and this is really difficult sometimes, and especially in article length work, it can be difficult, but provide details and examples of your analytical process. How specifically did you actually go from a text to a conclusion about the text? And of course, ideally, somebody would speak to the validity and quality, or what we might call trustworthiness, within their work, and any sort of ethical concerns that may have come up in the course of doing the study. Then moving on from methods to having a findings section. This is where you really kind of take those pieces of language and show what they mean and show the kind of implications of things. So a findings section really needs to be well organized, and oftentimes you'll want to use headings that are relevant to the analysis. So if you break things into themes, you want to have headings that kind of present those themes systematically. Or if you're using particular aspects of a linguistic element or a linguistic concept in your piece, you might, or several different ones, you could organize the headings to be about those specific linguistic elements. Now, in discourse analysis, it's very important that you focus on explicating specific examples. So you can't be really broad and vague about things. You actually want to have pieces from your data, raw pieces of data, that are present in the actual findings section. And oftentimes that's going to be the frequent use of quotes from the data. Lots of times if you look at discourse analysis that looks at conversation transcripts, for instance, you'll have actual chunks of the conversation and the speaking turns that are in there, and the analyst will go through those turns and explain them, explain the quotes, and then point out specific parts of the quotes as evidence to move from the actual raw text into a kind of interpretation of the text. Also in the findings section, you can use tables and figures if you need to. It's not the most common thing in the world within discourse analysis, but there are people who do use tables and figures, particularly if they're going to use a large corpus and they've got done some quantitative analysis of what's in that corpus. Oftentimes you'll see figures and tables. You might see if there's a kind of visual discourse analysis or a multimodal discourse analysis. Figures especially would be in there, and things about those figures would be pointed out within the text and how they fit along with the analysis. And then you'd have a discussion section where you'd kind of explain the implications for knowing what we know from your article. So in the findings, you've worked through specific examples of language, and now you're going to say, okay, well, what does all of that mean? What are the implications for practitioners, for policymakers, for researchers, for the general public? Now that we know that whatever kind of thing is going on in the discourse that you've pointed out is happening, why do we need to know it? And then, of course, there's the sort of other stuff that goes along with an academic article, things like references. So you'd want to have, obviously, references to lots of discourse analysis. You might have notes. Oftentimes it'll be in notes, so you'll have the superscript numbers within the text. Perhaps it'll be things like transcription conventions if you haven't put them in the text already. So particularly for those of you who are using transcription and you've got symbols that need to be explained, you can put those. You could put them in a lot of places. You could put them in the method section. You could put them where the transcript first appears. You can put them in the notes, or you could even put them in the appendices. So appendices are oftentimes helpful, but only for supplemental items that illuminate the main content of the article. So you don't want to put things that really actually belong in the article to help people understand your argument. You want to have sort of extra tables that are related but not completely necessary for being able to understand the argument. So those are the typical parts of any kind of discourse analysis article. I want to give you an example so you can kind of see these things in process. So the example I'm going to use is one by Zimmerman from 2012, and it's an article called Acceptance of Dying, a Discourse Analysis of Palliative Care Literature from the Journal of Social Science and Medicine. Now, unfortunately, for those of you who are only watching on YouTube and not in one of my classes, I can't actually provide a copy of this, but there is the citation, so you can hopefully find one for yourself. Also, keep in mind that this is not necessarily a perfect example of discourse analysis, and it's not one that necessarily applies to every situation that you might be writing about. But there are some things going on here that I think help demonstrate concretely just one example of how we might go about looking for what looks like a discourse analysis. So here's the article as it was downloaded. And you'll note that I said that, oftentimes you'll want a title that signals a discourse analysis. And you can see in this one that there's an actual, the words discourse analysis in the title. Now that also shows that what the corpus is that they're looking at. So it's a discourse analysis of palliative care literature. So you are both getting the actual words discourse analysis, but you also get a sense of what the corpus is. And as I also mentioned, that you want to signal that there's discourse analysis going on in the abstract. So for instance, here in the abstract, you've got the actual words discourse analysis, and particularly it's on the use of the term acceptance. How do people use that term discursively? It refers to the corpus that you're using, palliative care literature from 1970 to 2001. And again, the words critical discourse analysis come up to show the more specific methodology that's being used. And you'll see other terms in the discourse or in the abstract that refer to discourse. So things like intertextuality. This is a very popular term within discourse analysis. And you'll notice that they use a Foucauldian perspective, the works of Michel Foucault, suggesting that the discourse on acceptance of dying represents a productive power which disciplines patience. So you can kind of get a sense of not only that discourse analysis is going to go on, but what kind of discourse analysis. It's going to be a critical Foucauldian discourse analysis. Now, I also told you that you want to have things going on in your introductory paragraph that help people understand that discourse analysis is going on. So it describes what scholars need to know, hints at general corpus or genre investigated, and provides a discourse-related thesis. And you can see that here. So the first sentence and then a couple sentences down give you a sense of what the problem is. And the problem is that, in contemporary Western attitudes towards death, it's been characterized as one of denial. However, there has not been a similar investigation of the opposite of death denial, the acceptance of death and dying. So that's the problem that they're working on. And the last 2 points that introductory paragraph should have are kind of incorporated in this last sentence of the paragraph. This is the subject that I will address in this paper. All right, so this article will, using the method of discourse analysis, right? So providing a discourse-related thesis, analyze how the term acceptance is used regarding death and dying in the clinical palliative care literature. So you've got basically the corpus identified in that very first paragraph, and you've got a sense of exactly what the topic being investigated is right there in that paragraph. So this is actually a really good introductory paragraph that hits kind of all the high notes of what we would expect from a discourse analysis piece. Now, background information, it's a little bit difficult to know often what kinds of information people might need. A lot of times if you're not hitting all those points in the peer review process or when you get your paper graded by your instructor, they'll tell you, like, I don't understand this piece, you need to explain more about it, those kinds of things. So really do pay attention to what people are asking for when they give you that kind of feedback, because they really want to understand some of the larger issues, the way that the actual text that you're presenting work. In this particular article, they give more background information on the use of the term denial. So this particular researcher has looked at the term denial of death, and now they're going to talk about in this paper the opposite of denial, acceptance. So they give some more information about denial in that first paragraph, and then talk a little bit more about acceptance and what that means in the next paragraph. Of course, again, you want a method section or being spread throughout. In this particular article, they actually have a specific section for methods. It'll cite previous discourse analysis theorists and methodologists, as I said. You'll see Potter and Wetherell, Parker, talking about very specific methods that other discourse analysts have used. Now, also, earlier in the piece, in the introductory section, they talk about discourse analysis and what it does and what it means as well, not just here in the method section. So this one actually does a lot of work outside the method section to talk about methods. Now, you'll also note that in the method section, you want to specify the corpus that you're working with. And here they talk about doing a Medline search, 1970 to 2001, combining the text words accept or acceptance with the subject headings terminal care or palliative care or hospice care, and restricting the search to English. Now that netted them 180 articles. Then they talk about further restricting that to clinical journals discussing acceptance of death in adults. And then they talk about all these sections that, or all these concepts that may show up in the literature, but that they need to exclude for what they're actually looking for. So there's a long list there. And in the end, what they come up with is 40 articles. Now, it also should have, in a methods section, details and examples of the analysis process. So there were lots of details about how the corpus was put together and what was not in the corpus as well as what was. The details and examples about analysis, right? So the corpus is really more about sort of the sampling. Now this is the analysis part. They talk about articles being coded, and particularly which kind of method, Potter and Wetherell's method, was used for that coding. They talk about categories of themes being collected by photocopying all the relevant pages containing a certain theme and then placing them in their own file. That's a very specific kind of detail. And talking about using an attention to intertextuality. In my sense is that, there could be a little bit more in terms of details and examples for this analysis, but there's some pretty good details and examples here. But then you move on to the findings section, and the findings are, in this case, are organized with headings that are relevant to the analysis. And I really like this opening paragraph here because it talks about providing a detailed analysis of the first theme out of 3 themes that they've described above. So when they did the analysis, it came out with acceptance is integral to the practice of palliative care, positive characteristics of the acceptant patient, and acceptance of natural death. So this particular paper is only going to look at the first theme. And they also talk about 2 sub-themes within it as well. Acceptance as a facilitator for palliative care as a related sub-theme to 2 others. So they've kind of laid out exactly how the themes are broken down within the results section. And then you can see each of these particular themes and sub-themes has its own heading. And within that section with that heading, they talk specifically about the theme, what it means, and give at least one example for the theme that they break down and talk about. So you can see here's other themes. You can see up at the top, conveying acceptance, the clinician's role, and then over to the side you'll see measuring acceptance. So these are some particular themes that have organized headings. Now, within the findings section, I mentioned that you have to focus on explicating specific examples. Usually you do the examples by using frequent quotes of actual data. And then in paragraphs after the quotes, actually explain the quotes, usually by pointing out specific parts and quotes as evidence for your interpretation of the quotes. And you can see here, in this measuring acceptance theme, that they've got a paragraph straight out of the literature. This is one of the quotes that they analyzed to put this theme together of measuring acceptance. And it says, the acceptance of death by the patients was judged according to the way they spent their remaining time, to their attitudes, and to their hope for a life after death. 14 of 15 patients appeared to accept their own death. As the goal of death education in home hospice care is the acceptance of death by both patient and family, our methods of death education appear to be effective. And you'll notice below when they start talking about this particular quote, and they sort of explain what's going on, they say there's an assumption that patients and families need to be educated about death, and that the goal of this education is acceptance. Acceptance is judged according to criteria determined by the investigators. So they're trying to give more information about that larger quote that represents the theme. And in explaining it, they're using actual quoted words pulled out from the text. And this could be either from the example quote that they're using right there, or it could be from could be quoted words that are used kind of commonly across a lot of these texts, since they're pulling from a lot of different texts. This is a really important piece of how to write a discourse analysis. So important that I actually have a separate video that you could watch. There's a video that I have on the YouTube channel on writing up qualitative findings paragraphs. So if you're wondering how to take these pieces of text and really work on them, you should go and click that part there on the screen or down below and watch that video as well. Later, once you've done all the findings and you've explained all the themes, you should have a discussion section. And basically in this discussion section, you're going to explain the implications of knowing what we know from your particular analysis within the article. So they've broken down many of these themes from all of the literature on palliative care. And they give an explanation of why this is important. They say, these discourses on acceptance and denial stand at opposite poles of the same discourse. Together they both presuppose and contribute to the construction of a larger discourse on a correct way to die. which is closely linked with changes in the practice of medicine and idealized in the construct of the good death. The necessity of planning for the future, of discussing end-of-life decisions, such as where to die, whether or not to resuscitate, whether or not to feed, whether or not to hydrate, creates an imperative for patients to openly discuss and, quote, accept that they are dying. The model of aware dying is not only a modern psychological ideal, it's a medical necessity of a system that relies on open discussion for the efficient management of the dying person. The acceptant patient is favored because this attitude is concordant with institutional practices and makes dying easier not only for the patient and family, but for those caring for the dying and for the systems supporting these practices. Now you can see throughout all of this discussion that Foucauldian language that we talked about earlier on. So when they talk about having a discourse analysis that is critical and Foucauldian, eventually it has to come up with this notion of control of the body, discourse as framing discipline, and supporting institutions and the needs of institutions. And you can see this being pulled up here in this discussion section. So the implications of all of those themes, this notion of acceptance and what acceptance means and requires, comes up within the discussion section. So too, in a later paragraph, this notion of that there's an imperative to accept death, tightly connected with the quest of hospice and palliative care to relieve physical, psychological, social, and spiritual suffering. That also cannot be separated from the institutions of hospice and palliative care and the structure of broader healthcare systems. For it's through the acceptance of death itself and of the state of dying that death can be managed and controlled. So again, all of these kinds of Foucauldian issues, and you'll see that Foucault is actually cited there later in the paragraph as well in terms of coercion and those kinds of things, that really help to frame the discussion and explain what the implications are for having this focus on the notion of acceptance. Finally then, there's the other stuff that happens. Now, of course, this article has references to the things that it's cited. Now, they're not using transcription in this particular article because they're looking at literature, so the scientific literature on palliative care. But they do have an appendix, and this is a good example of how an appendix can actually be a supplemental addition to the article. In this case, they have the articles that were included in the discourse analysis. So the 40 articles that were actually used to develop their themes, they've listed all of them here just in case someone wanted to go back and look through those themselves. Now, this is helpful in terms of being able to kind of check on their methodology, but it's not absolutely critical to understanding the text, right? You can still understand the text and get what their interpretations are without knowing this, but this is something they can go back to. Now, one thing that students oftentimes want to do with appendices is they want to include things like IRB forms, Institutional Review Board forms, or correspondence that they've had with participants, or they might want to include every single transcript from their entire corpus. Appendices really aren't intended for that. Again, it's usually something that's at least marginally related to one's need to go back and understand the study better, but not crucial to understanding the study. So you don't really need to include everything that you've done, like within the research, in appendices. Try to limit those as much as possible. So that's hopefully going to give you some help in understanding how to write up a discourse analysis. If I can be of any help, please let me know. Thanks.